Hello. Today is the 6th of December in 2020, and I'm excited for today. We've got quite the story to share with you fine friends. There are several campaigns that I'm proud of. There isn't just one. Here They Be Science, Here They Be Dragons. That is one I'm pretty proud of. This one, this next one I'm also very proud of. So, what am I doing? I was listening to a previous recording I made to make sure everything was alright. Sorry about that. But yeah, before going on, I thought that I would mention that I realized that I could honestly, I made a bunch of notes for myself about some of my campaigns. Not all of them, but some of my earlier ones. And I can just read what I wrote as well. So I might be doing a bit of that as well as a bit of explanation. But what I'm going to talk about today is a campaign that I titled United They Stood, Depraved They Fell. So, this campaign was built off of several interesting ideas. First of all, I was going to be the next Dungeon Master. And the players, we always thought that, so we were discussing what sort of theme we wanted, right? We did steampunk, we did Norse, we did the Asian floating continent, whatever. We thought Revolutionary War, the American Revolutionary War, would be a fun setting. Now, this is unusual for Dungeons & Dragons, because usually in most Dungeons & Dragons campaigns, you're just using some kind of generic fantasy world. There is a specific fantasy world that is in the published adventures for 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. It's a setting called the Forgotten Realms, or Faerun. But I mean, you can set your Dungeons & Dragons campaign anywhere, anytime, however you want. It is unusual to set it in history, like an actual history, or at least a fantasy alternative universe version of it. But honestly, just the idea of a Revolutionary War themed campaign just sort of hit like a natural 20 to all of us. And so that alone made this sort of groundbreaking for all of us. The second main concept of this was that the players wanted, we hadn't gone from level 1 to level 20 before. And the players really wanted to do that. That'd be fun. We've gone from level 1 to level 10 to 12-ish. We've gone from 10 to 15 or something like that. We even had the sort of overpoweredness of Warhammer 40k, but we've never done level 1 to level 20. And so we decided to do that with this campaign. Now, as part of my preparation for this, I took lots of different, I took inspiration from some of my favorite, bits of entertainment that used the Revolutionary War history and that kind of thing. And again, I'm talking about the American Revolutionary War. Just that time, just a fascinating time period, and the birth of a nation and everything. And watching the musical Hamilton, by the way, in recent years has sort of reignited that interest to some degree. But yeah, so. First of all, I had to kind of reimagine the world, right? So we would kind of be using an alternative version of Earth, but we'd still be using the fantasy races of Dungeons and Dragons. And so I decided that each of the races the races in D&D would correspond to a different region of the world. For example, I had Native Americans as, if you were an elf, you were essentially the Native Americans, the people native to the continent of America. Most humans are from Europe. If you were up in the Nordic area, like Scandinavia, you were a dwarf. If you were in Siberia, northern Russia, that was gnome. East Asia area was dragonborn. Middle East area was tieflings, and I also had elves. In the Polynesian and Oceania area as well. And then for Africa, it was hard for me to I didn't want to disparage any one group or region or whatever. So I didn't want, what I kind of had left was halfling or orc, and neither of those felt like they fit Africa in my mind. By the way, I don't know if I need to, but I also feel I should probably defend why I use Tiefling for Middle Eastern. For some reason, the Tiefling race just seemed like they seem like the kind of people that would be more used to like maybe desert regions or things like that. Desert and those coastal regions. I don't know. It made sense in my head. For Africa, I kind of made a. I didn't want those people to be short, and I didn't want them to be brutal. So I decided to combine the best of each race into a sort of halfling and orc race, essentially. I called this the African or the Afro race, for lack of a better term. I will say the players didn't really go too far with their characters. They were either elves or one was a dragonborn. Most were humans, that sort of thing. But the options were there if they wanted. But essentially, apart from that, and like as far as classes go, I was sticking to the standard Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition classes. I was open to homebrew, so it was another homebrew campaign. When your classes applied, was open to interpretation. Since this was kind of like slightly more urbanized than a typical medieval fantasy setting, magic appears as the result of experimental science and alchemy usually. But or maybe for the elves, magic is derived more from herbs and natural phenomena. Sorry. Or chanted blessings or curses and things like that. Focusing on a belief of greater powers or beings. I was very flexible, but I came up with some basic logic using the real world history as an example. I also wrote a document for the players to read for like setting assumptions, so that they could. This is the first time I made something like this, so the players could refer to it and see like what I'm expecting, what they should expect in the setting I made. So it took place in the late 1700s during the American Revolutionary War and its aftermath. Generally speaking, I decided that we would assume real world history up to that point, with the addition of magic and mythical creatures and fantasy inspired races. So from the first session onward, history would unfold in whatever direction the players decided. Like whatever the players could influence, I would allow them to influence history insofar as their characters would be able to, essentially. But yeah, I also imagine that the New World America was a much more wild. I really love American folk tales, American folklore, right? I mean, Norse mythology, Greek mythology, Egyptian mythology, Celtic, whatever, African folklore, all those kinds of things. Those are all fascinating. There's something about American folklore. There's something that's so, I guess I feel like there's some je ne sais quoi to it for some reason. I just really love the sort of creatures and the kind of tales that have come out of American literature and folklore and that kind of thing. Creatures like the Thunderbird, the Jersey Devil, the Wampus Cat, the Jackalope, Bigfoot, and many more. Headless Horseman is another classic example. To kind of build this more fantastical world, I took inspiration from American tall tales as well as how J.K. Rowling set stories in America. J.K. Rowling's Wizarding World stories include Wampus Cat and Thunderbird and things like that. Also, I had read a series called Alvin Maker by Orson Scott Card. That was another source of inspiration for that. I decided that place names would pretty much be the same. People's names may differ a little bit. Because, I forgot. Not only did the players want to go from level 1 to level 20, they wanted to start with level 1 good aligned characters and evolve into level 20 evil aligned characters. That was a big thing that they wanted to explore. We were never really like evil characters before, and so that was also a bit groundbreaking for our group as well. So that would mean that most of the NPCs, the non-player characters that I acted as or took the place of as a dungeon master, would be a lot of the founding fathers, which I was excited about. I would apply some fantasy principles to some of these people. For example, George Washington, I imagine him, with his military background and his place in American history, I imagine him as a paladin when he takes his oath of office that would modify his role and impact in history, things like that. Except I didn't call him George Washington because this is an alternative version. I called him George Washington, kind of softening the sh to a j, George Washington. And like the spelling of Benjamin Franklin, the like there is like is the AE symbol. Things like that, or Thomas Jefferson with like a GE instead of a J. I changed little things like that to kind of differentiate this setting from real world history. But yeah, I also was going to take some some cues from the downtime activities guidelines from the Dungeon Master's Guide. Training levels between sessions. Like there would be time between battles and between events in American history and that kind of thing. I also wrote a section about the limits of evil. Now, we were a good friend group, I think. Like, we had a fair amount of trust, and there were certain boundaries that we would not really... there were certain boundaries that I kind of figured that we would automatically not I felt we would probably automatically not cross. But also, just to make sure we were on the same page, I wrote up this little bit about limitations of evil. And I also will say that, this friend group, most, if not all of us, were members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, with similar standards, with similar standards in terms of language and the entertainment we often watched and things like that. And so, with some variability in there, of course, but we all know we had and even if they weren't members of the church, even those who were members of the church had similar standards anyway, at least in Dungeons and Dragons. So, I'll go ahead and read what I had here. I was probably being overly cautious here, but it was a good guideline, and this was not a problem for anybody. So I said, this campaign will focus on the descent of the player characters into evil and madness. While this is a fresh new approach for me and the players, we felt it was important to set some boundaries regarding how bad the characters would be allowed to be. These boundaries are meant to keep the game within everyone's comfort zone. So kind of there's a lot of talk in tabletop RPG communities about talking about safety, people's comfort levels, and that kind of thing. Not something we really ever talked about as a group before this point because we were very good friends. But, it was good to go over this. Anyway, I said that this campaign would not go beyond a PG-13 movie rating or a TV video game rating or a PEGI 12 or something. We had played lots of D&D together. We had already established a group culture in which violence, language, and actions would be kept at an appropriate level. So I was never really worried, but I decided to share the following thoughts and guidelines. As a general rule, in this and any form of fiction, I find it is description that should be kept in check, more so than a character's actions. For example, we know that Anakin Skywalker in the Star Wars movies killed younglings, but in the Star Wars film, we see almost nothing of the act directly, so it becomes less disturbing for the audience. It's still disturbing, but it's more palatable in entertainment. Anyway, I guess. And by the way, I should also say that I pretty much still hold these principles, these standards to myself in general, to this day as well. It's just not a whole lot has changed. Personally, my personal preferences and guidelines. But yeah, for this campaign, because we were dealing with historical events, I was a little worried that we may encounter sensitive topics because topics like slavery, oppression, and inequality, they were more prevalent during the 1700s in America. I figured it would be a given that, players would differentiate their own language, their action, and philosophies from that of their characters. Their characters are going to be evil, but the players themselves are not going to be. And actually, I will say that we pretty much as far as I know, we never, slavery never came up in this campaign. We always focused on, the historical battles and, conventions and events that helped, directly found America as a government and as a nation. Anyway, continuing on with what the evil player characters do, I do feel that I can accept most violence, oppression, dishonesty, political corruption, and the like, as long as it isn't too intense or graphic. Also, we will stay away from really bad abuse, I trusted the group, but I just wanted to say I did not want any sexual abuse of any kind mentioned in the campaign. So I trusted them. I just wanted to keep the evil acts on the conservative side of the PG-13 realm. I could handle the oppression, trickery, and tyranny of a dictator, but some other things like depraved, cannibalistic things would be too much for this particular one, like especially gory and stuff. In short, while the PCs will become their worst selves, the players and the DM will continue to be their very best selves. And I gave some examples of like good to bad stories that were kept within a PG-13 rating. Anakin Skywalker to Darth Vader, Harvey Dent to Two-Face in the Batman movies, Buddy to Syndrome in the Incredibles movie. We also, I guess depending on how it is performed, we also have Macbeth, Othello, most people's depiction of King David in the Bible. There's also an example in the Book of Mormon of someone named Korihor as well. Things like that. I probably spent too much time talking about that. If we get into the actual stories, been chatting about this for 15 minutes. Let's get on with it, shall we? I should also say that this was the first time I dealt, and this is the time I felt firsthand how chaotic a group of 11 to 12, a group of 10 to 11 players actually was. I think like the first session, people kept bringing their friends to check out D&D and whatever, and people could barely fit around the table. There was like 10 or 11 people sitting around for the first session, which was the Battle of Lexington, which I'll get to in a second. But that was just crazy and chaotic. And I think some of the friends might have gotten a bit bored because it took so long to get to their turn and everything. I don't recommend playing with more than like 7 players. 7 is like my personal like limit essentially as far as size goes. 4 to 6 is ideal. 7 I could manage. Once you get into 8 and above, it gets to be kind of unfair for the rest of the players. As far as like, how much time is dedicated to each character in a battle or things like that. It depends on the campaign, of course. But anyway, so it's... also there were times when we had we kind of skipped around time a bit. Like there was the main campaign where the characters would go from level 1 to level 20, but then also sometimes only a handful of players, a couple of the players would be there, and they wanted to experiment with their level 20 characters sooner. And so I decided to have like a bit of a flash forward, sort of a mini, like a B plot sort of a thing. So that, the players wrote a level 20, another character sheet, a level 20 version of their character, and then the other one was the one that would develop into a level 20 character. So the level 20 like encounters, the ones that were level 20 from the get-go, they were simply for fun, as the more consistent players waited for other players to show up, essentially, and it's set in the future. So it's at this point where I'll start to like read like directly from some of my notes. I'm not going to read from my notes for the whole like campaign that I'm sharing here. Just like for like the first handful of like sessions or little chunks of adventure. Some of the crazier stories though, I'm going to say more extemporaneously without reading, because some wild stuff happened in this campaign. In United they stood, depraved they fell. But I'll start reading a few things. I anticipate this will be a longer Decem Baron video than normal. Anyway, so this is for the flash forward level 20 encounters. It is the year 1812, and our heroes have long succumbed to their depraved evil natures. Although they were each instrumental in the War of Independence and the foundation of the United States of America, they have now become enemies of freedom and perverters of justice. As another war with the Old World seemed imminent, and fearing that his former constitutional colleagues would soon turn against America once again, President James Madison cordially invited these 4 anti-heroes, Jack Mcdonough, Hanzo, Clermont, and Oliver, to his residence in Washington, D.C., to settle their differences like gentlemen. The time and place was set and honored by our 4 players, and they met President Madison as well as former President Thomas Jefferson at the front lawn of the White House. Madison and Jefferson accused the 4 gentlemen of their murderous and traitorous actions against America, and the meeting soon came to blows, as was expected. However, Madison and Jefferson had a few tricks up their sleeves. First, they summoned the spirit of America, which was embodied in a slim, older man with surprising strength, Uncle Sam. A little sidebar here. I actually found a stat block, homebrewed, someone made Uncle Sam in D&D, and monsters and bosses and whatever, they would have a stat block, kind of a block of text and numbers that would explain the statistics and the mechanics of the monster or the boss and what abilities they had and stuff like that. I found a stat block for Uncle Sam online, and I used that, and I was really excited about it. The apparition of freedom spoke. Now, before we become engaged in our little debate, I have one question to pose to you, gentlemen. Who's your uncle? I'll receive your answers after we finish defeating all of you in the name of liberty and justice. I'm pretty proud of that. I was pretty proud of that. The battle commenced, and it was hard fought. Early on, Jefferson was killed, and Uncle Sam was becoming very weak. Then a barrage of cannonballs fell on the 4 adversaries. Madison explained that since they dare fight against the U.S. Constitution, the USS Constitution, the ship also nicknamed Old Ironsides, is fighting back. The cannonballs were annoying, but unfortunately not devastating to the players. These were level 20 homebrew characters, so they were a bit overpowered. But again, it was still fun. Then came the finishing blow, and this is the pièce de résistance. I was so happy with this. Behind the shadows of the White House, a gargantuan monstrosity emerged. Madison explained that before he died, Hamilton gave our nation a blessing and a curse. For us, a blessing, he said. For you, the evil characters, a curse. The monstrosity was the United States national debt. Essentially, I was inspired by Schoolhouse Rock. They do lots of really great educational music videos and stuff. And one of their sets of songs was called America Rock. They had songs about, American history, especially the American Revolution and America's founding. One of the songs is about the national debt. And they personified the national debt as a huge, as a growing and huge red, white, and blue dinosaur, like Tyrannosaurus Rex. And we had never fought a Tarrasque before. A Tarrasque is the most powerful and ginormous canonical monster in official monster in Dungeons and Dragons. It has the highest challenge rating. It's basically a Godzilla. I think that's one of the best ways to put it in non-D&D terms. It's something that I use the stats for a Tarrasque to personify the United States national debt to attack these level 20 characters. At this point, the characters realized they had bitten off more than they could chew, and each of them fled the field to regroup in a local pub to fight against freedom another day. So that was sort of a prologue. So now here is Chapter 1, or Episode 1, the Battle of Lexington. So, we're back to level 1, the real beginning of the campaign. It was the year 1775, and the new colonies known collectively as America. Tensions between America and her mother Britain have been running high for years, and at long last, they were coming to a head in battle. The Americans have amassed an impressively diverse army, though the British army is much more impressive in numbers. On one spring evening, a group of soldiers gathered around a campfire awaiting news of the British movement. They were as follows. Oliver Acondo, a half-native, half-European bardic rogue, using College of Blades and some time thief archetype, whose loyalty remained strong with his native ancestry and very strongly against the British assassins who murdered his father. Strangely enough, the assassins called themselves the King's Watchmen, a group to which Oliver's father once belonged. Some secrets of the Watchmen have been passed down to Oliver. The side note here, I used... there's an Assassin's Creed game that is set in the American Revolution. And so I took inspiration from that as well as the movie National Treasure to incorporate some sort of Watchmen, Knights Templar kind of interesting little plot kind of thing. So, which I had fun with. You'll hear bits and pieces of that as we go on. Another character was Jack Mcdonough, a timid, well-traveled, well-learned Scottish man who specializes in all kind of alchemical science and magic. He became an American ally and became more acquainted with the ways of the natives. As we'll soon see, however, the hulking savagery that now lies dormant in Mr. Mcdonough's psyche. Clément, a French rogue who, like most French men, has come to hate the British and sees the American conflicts as a way to fight the power that he believes has plagued his homeland for too long. But will he later become part of the very problem he's sworn to fight against? Hamzo, a native of the Asian countries and thus a natural dragonborn. But he is of a more special and secret draconic bloodline, so he looks more European than Asian. For his own reasons, he has traveled from Asia across the world to the western lands of America and was led by the natives to the eastern civilization of the New World. A trained assassin, and perhaps something much more powerful, he keeps his words and his secrets to himself for a reason. Drake, a native rogue who has tremendous animosity for civilized man, but he sees freedom as a result of an American victory. Tiger Lily, a native shaman or wizard, and one of several women who wish to actively participate in the upcoming war, but became disguised as a man to keep from danger and suspicion. Virginia, a half-native, half-European warlock with similar desires as Tiger Lily to join the American-British War. And Lagatha, a female cleric from the Nordic countries, a dwarf. Her ties with the British have brought her to America, and she has been persuaded to join the American cause. These characters surrounded a campfire as their captain approached. He told them that the army would be alerted to the British troops' advance by lights shining from the Old North Church in Boston, 1 if by land, 2 if by sea, 3 if by air. The well-known blacksmith and activist, I named him Paul Revere. In real history, it's Paul Revere, but I named him Paul Revere, was performing reconnaissance and would alert the soldiers in the church of any movement. Soon, 2 lights appeared from the chapel's steeple, and the colonial army immediately mobilized. The next morning, the colonists were stationed at Lexington, forming a wall between Boston and the military arsenal stashed in Concord. The captain ordered all soldiers to form 2 long straight ranks to make the line. Our heroes, originally assigned to the very front line, protested the strategy, suggesting that they break from the line and retreat into the woods behind their own army to shoot from a distance and from cover. The captain was intrigued by this idea and allowed them to do so. So originally I was planning on just having them part of the normal musket shooting lines, but the player characters didn't want that because they felt vulnerable, which they were. So they decided to be the ones to kind of go in the back. And yeah, they met the British forces, and the first shot was fired. The shot heard around the world. In actuality, it would be more accurate to call it the twang heard around the world, because it was Tiger Lily's anxious hand that let an arrow fly prematurely, killing a redcoat on the spot. The Battle of Lexington, and indeed the Revolutionary War, had begun. As the colonists and the redcoats exchanged musket fire, our heroes continued to fire from the trees, mostly with muskets. So the player characters were in the trees, while most of the colonial army were out in the open. So there were more people to ambush the redcoats. The women were especially effective. Virginia threw a grease spell at the redcoats, followed closely by Tiger Lily's fireball. The fire spread in seconds, cutting through the British lines. Lagatha was also very effective with her musket, killing with almost every shot, while healing and stabilizing the wounded in her party when she could. The party desperately needed this healing when the British captain ordered his men to fire into the woods. The musket blows were too strong for some of our heroes, but little by little, the British were getting weaker. Eventually, the party had helped the rest of the colonial army to wipe out the British regiment, but this was no time for celebration, for in the distance, more redcoat lines could be seen. The colonists retreated to Concord, and there diminished what was left of British morale, taking out more soldiers as the redcoats retreated. The party's captain, quite impressed with each of our heroes, decided to recommend each of them as higher officers. It is clear that the beginning of the Revolutionary War was also the beginning of greatness for each of these warriors. And yet, it was also the beginning of animosity. Most notable is a small skirmish between Jack Mcdonough and Drake. Jack, who kept a diary, wrote a few disparaging words against Drake, which upset the native. A scuffle ensued, and later Jack convinced their captain that it was Drake's fault. Although the scenario could compare to the bickering of schoolboys, Drake was one to hold a grudge. He started to hate Europeans, such as Jack. Yes, the American colonists won the battle, but the war was just beginning. Moving on to the next chapter. With a little bit of development for the 1812 incident, and then moving back to the normal campaign. So, in 1812, after the initial match against Madison, Jefferson, Uncle Sam, and the National Debt, our four anti-heroes decided their next move before going back to the White House would be to capture the USS Constitution, which was docked nearby under the command of Andrew Jackson. They infiltrate the ship, and Hanzo goes straight for the level below deck where 30 cannons and about a dozen sailors were resting. When he attacked, slaughtering all the sailors, the youngest of which was 20. This massacre was just another easy task for Hanzo. Meanwhile, on the main deck, the rest of the party... Why did I say the age there? Oh, I think Hanzo's player specifically asked about that for some strange reason. Anyway, meanwhile, on the main deck, the rest of the party found Jackson, and Jack Mcdonough created a force cage around him and Jackson. By now, Jack had become more barbaric than intelligent. So think of the Hulk, essentially, but evil. And he easily grappled his foe. Jackson put up a good fight, however, until Jack and the rest of the party... Jackson put up a good fight until Jack Mcdonough and the rest of the party decided to negotiate with him. They invited him to join them in their fight against President Madison and the National Debt. The promise of power was very convincing, and Andrew Jackson decided to join them and give them control over the USS Constitution. So now we go back to the past. In the fall of 1777, the remainder at the Brandywine Creek between Baltimore and Philadelphia. Under normal circumstances, the party would be asked to fight as infantry or as bombardiers in a battle that would eventually become a tactical victory for the British, but our heroes had distinguished themselves from the very start of the war, so our senior officers had a few special assignments for them. Most of the party was tasked to travel to Fort Ticonderoga to assist Henry Knox in delivering dozens of reclaimed cannons to Cambridge, Massachusetts. The distance from the fort to Cambridge is about 300 miles, which is probably about a 4-hour drive for those of us in modern times. The journey was treacherous, as it was filled with monsters, some of which were the stuff of legend. And this time they encountered and fought the Headless Horseman, just 50 feet before crossing a covered bridge. It was a tough fight, but eventually the party fought their way through the vorpal sword swings and the flaming pumpkin attacks and destroyed the fiend. It is worth mentioning that the journey would have also had the characters encounter Wampus Cats and the Thunderbird and even Sasquatch. But I think I only ran an encounter with the Headless Horseman because I found a cool stat block for him. Lots of talking. Wow. I'm enjoying this. I hope you are as well. While most of the party was traveling to Henry Knox's position, 3 heroes skilled in espionage and stealth, Hanzo, Oliver, and Drake, were taken aside and given a special mission from General Washington himself. They were instructed to deliver a box of papers to the convict transport ship Charlotte in the New York harbor. Oliver remembered from his father's stories that the King's Watchmen had been looking for what they called the Templar treasure, which was hidden by their opposing faction, the Masons. Some time ago, the Watchmen got hold of a single brief clue. The secret lies with Charlotte. Naturally, the Watchmen spent many hours seeking this secret by searching through cemeteries and family records, but to no avail. Oliver, who had also informed Hanzo of what he knew about the Watchmen, the Masons, and the treasure, was naturally intrigued by the supposed coincidence that they were delivering a box of papers, so they were told, to a ship with that same enigmatic name. As the 3 rogues were traveling, they opened the box and found, beneath the papers, a small ornate pipe made in ivory and wood. The trio were still planning to carry out their mission. While still planning to carry out their mission, wanted to find someone who could make a replica of this piece so they could deliver the replica but keep the original. In a small town just outside of New York, they found a craftsman who could perform the job. Turned out the craftsman was James Monroe, who happened to be a mason and thus was aware of the significance of the pipe. He had a little chat with the trio of rogues and discovered that they were each ultimately against the British, as well as the King's Watchmen, with Oliver having a personal vendetta against the Watchmen. Monroe agreed to create the replica and informed our heroes that he would discuss with other high masons such as George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and Paul Revere about the possibility of including them into the intellectual ranks of the Freemasons. It should be noted too that on the stem of this mysterious pipe was carved a riddle. I'll read you the riddle, but you can see how much I was inspired by National Treasure. I really enjoyed that movie, honestly. Here was the riddle. The legend writ disdain affected, so disdain effected. The key in silence undetected. 55 in iron pen. Mr. Matlock can't offend. So, almost verbatim, the little changes from the movie. Anyway, in the cover of night, Hanzo, Oliver, and Drake eventually made their way to the New York harbor to deliver the box containing the replica of the pipe instead of the real one. They encountered a couple of military men, but the color of their coats were obscured in the darkness. It eventually became clear that they were British, particularly by their accent. Our heroes tried to obscure their true intentions, but the Watchmen saw through their deception and realized that what Charlotte was, and before the three rogues killed them, one of the Watchmen managed to shout, "The Charlotte is a ship!" Those were his last words in the service to Britain, to the Watchmen, and to his king. By the way, I do realize that rhyme, like Mr. Matlock can't offend or whatever. I know that's that's anachronistic, even with considering National Treasure, because normally in National Treasure that would have been written after the Declaration of Independence was written by this point. Never mind, ignore me. Moving on. Our heroes ran from other Watchmen, and Drake decided to execute his own daring escape and make it look as awesome as possible. He managed to climb to the top of a modest mansion, but then he fell through the roof, causing a few servants to search the top floor with lanterns. Hanzo and Oliver were able to hide in a nondescript tavern and inn and waited for their comrade. Drake quickly escaped the mansion and found Hanzo and Oliver in the tavern, but not before noticing the flag that hung outside the mansion, which bore the Union Jack, but with the addition of a simple watchtower crest in the middle. Excuse me. Drake managed to crash into an office building of the King's Watchmen. After hiding in the inn for the night, the trio made the delivery and then snuck into the Watchmen mansion. They didn't find much except several documents that detailed the efforts made by the King's Watchmen to find the Templar treasure. Although they had discovered the Charlotte as well as the contents of the recently delivered box, there was no indication that they had come any closer to finding the treasure or any additional intelligence on the Masons. They had found the clue on the pipe, but could not understand its meaning. The war continues, and there are battles on many fronts, both public and discreet. So, moving on. It was the fall of 1781. Many battles were fought since the twang heard around the world 7 years before. Military campaigns were fought long and hard in New York, in Boston, and in the South. At this time, the British seemed to be gaining great strides on all fronts, but the Americans had since gained a powerful ally. Thanks to the connections and influence provided by Clermont and Marc de Lafayette, the French Navy joined in the colonial cause, if nothing else but to infuriate and frustrate the British even further. In this crucial season, General Washington invited his finest officers and advisors to a war meeting with dinner provided by Martha Washington in his temporary home at Valley Forge. Dinner guests included Jack Mcdonough, Clermont, Hanzo, Drake, Oliver, and two other characters. One had an Asian appearance, a Red Dragonborn Ranger, and called himself Arhan Arnold Benedict, and the other looked like a mix between a native and an Afro, but it had a more wild, greenish appearance than most members of either race, and introduced himself as Spork Alexander Hamilton. He was a half-orc bard. I translated. So these are characters who transported from the Here There Be Science, Here There Be Dragons world into this one for their own mission or whatever, and they were masquerading as natives in this world. Anyway, these Washington had gathered to plan a siege on the port city of Yorktown in Virginia. 3 of those present, Hanzo, Jack, and Arnold, would infiltrate the city walls and communicate British strengths and weaknesses by sending a spell to the rest of the army. The remaining gentlemen would each take control of a regiment. And so this was the session where we did the Battle of Yorktown, and I had a whole map and everything, and I used some large scale battle rules that kind of had each player take control of a portion of the army, of the overall army. This was an Unearthed Arcana installment, or like a play testing thing that Wizards of the Coast had written. So yeah, we made use of that, and it proved fairly effective for what we wanted to do. The colonial regiments made a steady strategic advance on the city, focusing on the north and western fronts, while the spies approached from the southern front. Despite the advantage of the fortress, the British soldiers couldn't make much headway in getting rid of the Americans. And I used a real map of Yorktown, by the way, for this. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. As soon as the three spies were able to sneak past the walls, Jack tried to lead the British General Cornwalsh, astray through telepathic messages, pretending to be one of the British officers under Cornwalsh, instead of Cornwalsh. The general was convinced through Jack's messages that the colonial army would focus their attack on the southern walls, so he ordered most of his troops to fortify that front. As this was happening, Jack informed the other colonial leaders, again through magic telepathic messages, of the British movement. The colonials continued their heavy assault on the north and western walls, now the weakest parts of the fortress. Hanzo slaughtered any British soldier he could reach. Not much was seen of Arnold. Some suspected that he would turn traitor against the colonists, but he remained loyal and fought against the British. Eventually, the British lines were broken by the Blue Coat armies, and the colonists stormed into Yorktown. The colonists. The British attempted to surround the commanders, the player characters, within the city, but to no avail. Hanzo could handle a whole regiment of soldiers and hardly break a sweat. Finally, it was clear to General Cornwalsh that the battle was over for his army. He knew that he had lost Britain one of their last truly strategic positions. That, coupled with the might of the French Navy bearing down, he felt that the best thing for Great Britain would be to surrender control to the colonists. He raised the white flag of surrender, ready to discuss with the American military leaders, even with Washington himself, the conditions of surrender. And this is back when Hamilton was pretty big, touring, around, was new on Broadway. So I played a clip of that moment in the musical where a white flag is flown and everything for the players. But the players wanted more than a meager surrender. They wanted a slaughter of the Redcoats. This is a pivotal point for our heroes, who will soon be unworthy of the title. This was the true point of transition from good to evil. Unity with the cause of freedom succumbing to their depraved desires for blood and power. It was Jack Mcdonough who dealt the killing blow to Cornwalsh, and he even took the general's redcoat military redcoat. Yeah, the coat itself. Inside one of the pockets, he found a slip with these words, "Look to Franklin's bill." Needless to say, General Washington, though thrilled with the defeat and surrender of the British, was not pleased with the actions of our heroes. Nevertheless, he chose not to concern himself with the event, instead focusing on the details of the surrender with another British general and the first steps of true American freedom. Since that day, some remembered that final battle of the Revolution as the Battle of Yorktown, but those who knew better often gave it the bitter name of the Yorktown Massacre. And so now we're getting to the point where I don't really have notes anymore, but I'm going to share what I know and remember. And so after that pivotal point, we also had some sort of side moments and stuff like that. They did eventually defeat the National Debt, the Tarrasque. That was a lot of fun. Again, they were overpowered, level 20 characters. I had the Tarrasque swallow one or two of them, and they were all able to defeat them and win against Madison and Jefferson and Uncle Sam. And they just sort of had their own agenda and whatever. I don't think they took. Did they take over America at that point? I'm not sure if they did. It was just they were trying to settle their differences, and they won, and they fled right before the War of 1812 happened. But back to the normal story. I had a sort of a corn maze thing happen They're trying to find an artifact in there. One of several pivotal moments in this campaign was the Constitutional Convention. I had this roll-heavy session with the Constitutional Convention. I did some degree of research. I didn't research extensively. I did enough to make it feel relatively immersive for the players, right? And I knew a fair amount about the basics of what happened and how the Constitutional Convention was. So George Washington was the kind of the chair, the leader of the convention. And all of the player characters were part of the convention because they had such pivotal roles in the war and in helping to reestablish America and everything. So, naturally, the characters were like more and more evil at this point, and so they wanted to try to have the U.S. Constitution written in their favor. George Washington and a few others like Ben Franklin were, of course, against some of their more evil tactics, but they were able to sneak a few things in there. For one thing, they instead of a president of America, it was like the supreme ruler of America or something like that. They changed the name and everything. They changed how they kind of like altered a little bit like how elections worked and stuff like that. But like that was sort of a pivotal moment for the players to realize that Washington was one of their main antagonists, right? Lots of fun. Also, there was a moment where like the character who played Jack Mcdonough, which by the way is Jordan, the one who betrayed the party twice and everything in the past. Jack Mcdonough had so many qualms with Washington during the convention that and this was all roleplay, by the way, just like on the fly roleplay. I had Washington, like me acting as Washington, just say, you know what? Here, you take charge of the convention for a little bit. And I literally got up from my Dungeon Master's chair and I said, hey, yeah, Jordan, go ahead and sit here. Sit here in my chair. I'll sit in your chair. And and so I thought that was a very fun moment. And all the players really loved it as well. And so Jordan, the player of Jack Mcdonough, is just kind of like, all right, there's going to be some changes around here, sitting in the proverbial the Dungeon Master's seat and everything for a little bit. Then after the convention, I took back my seat and concluded the session. But yeah, that was a lot of fun. Soon after that, there was the election of 1790, the first election, and I had them play through what they did with their campaigning or any sort of like subterfuge to try to like bend the election in their favor. I say their favor. Jack Mcdonough was running for president, as was George Washington. So it was essentially between Mcdonough and Washington. And Mcdonough and the rest of the player characters be like his cabinet or his staff or whatever. So they worked together to try to try to disparage Washington's campaign and everything, and try to rig the campaign in their favor and that sort of thing. It was still pretty close, honestly. But Jack Mcdonough did win, and according to the Constitution, George Washington, being a second place winner, would get the title of vice president, meaning they would still have to work with General Washington. So, yeah. That didn't mean that everything was politics, though. They still did some adventures, such as chasing after an artifact in the Caribbean, where they fought a frost giant. Now, sorry, let me drink some more water here. We're getting to some really good stuff now. Golly gee, how long have I been at this? 50 minutes? Alright, it's going to be a long one. I hope you guys are fine with that. Maybe I should have done this in 2 parts. Hold on. Maybe. You know what? I'm going to save this. I'm going to end it here. 50 minutes is more than long enough for a December episode. If you're still listening, thank you. But wow, time goes by really fast. In the next tomorrow, I will share the rest of United They Stood, Depraved They Fell, and they found something in the Caribbean, and that alone, they wanted to try to assassinate George Washington, Vice President Washington, and also the conclusion, and some crazy stuff happened there. And the conclusion of this campaign was also wild as well. I will share all of that tomorrow. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a good rest of your day. All the best. Take care.